Hi, this is going to be a response to a question made by Chris Donovan. It's funny because at the same time I think he provided the answer as well. So I'm just going to be adding my 2 cents to this topic. So I'm going to read his comment, and he said, "Here's another topic that you might consider sometime in the future. How do role playing games improve people? I feel like my younger self gained a lot when it comes to vocabulary, understanding, mitigating probabilities, imagination, empathy, morality, and an eagerness to solve problems with the materials at hand. This question is inspired by a good friend of mine who is a role player and an important member of law enforcement. He credits much of his success to playing role playing games." So yes, I think that Chris provided a lot of details that could serve as a satisfactory answer or response to his own question, but I'll try to just to give you my perspective on this situation, on this question. When it comes to what I obtained from role playing games to improve myself, to become a better version, the cliche, a better version of myself, I think it's simulation and learning. It's quite important what he said here about his friend crediting his success to playing role playing games, because someone could be thinking, how can games actually, yes, serve as some sort of useful method or strategy or tactic in a real life situation? And it's because of the simulation aspect, but also because of the learning aspect as well. This is not always the case. That is, even though role playing games are great in many ways, this doesn't mean that all role players are going to be applying the best of role playing games in real life situations. In fact, sadly, there are many people that play role playing games that, to be perfectly honest, they're not very intelligent and not very thoughtful of this. I think that has a lot to do with escapism. There are some role players that have some personal issues, so they play these games in order to distance themselves from their real life situations. But related to the question made by Chris, the best way to implement what you obtain from role playing games is in a thoughtful, creative, and successful way when it comes to your everyday life activities. When it comes to the simulation aspect, you can experience all sorts of situations in role playing games, and because you are playing with other people and because you're also drawing upon your own body of knowledge, of life experience, anything that you have, yes, you went through during your existence, then you can see the outcomes of different situations within those simulations. I think I got into this simulation aspect pretty early when I started to play role playing games, because it started with board games and video games as well. I think that this is also related to board games and video games to a certain degree, although because of their limitations, because board games and video games are very different and have some limits, sometimes many limits when it comes to the adventures, the uses of different abilities, spells, powers, creative problem solving when compared to role playing games. Those forms of entertainment, some would say those art forms, they are limited because the limits placed upon them also have to do with the enjoyment we obtain from them. In board games, you want to play within those rules without cheating, without being too flexible, because you want to win the board game in a fair way, working within those limits. When it comes to video games, there are limitations in regards to the programming of the game, but there are also, because video games also want to challenge you, they purposefully intentionally place those limits so that you can find a way to work within those limits to defeat an enemy boss or go through a level, through a puzzle. But when it comes to role playing games, because it's to a certain degree a simulation of real life in a fictional environment, you can attempt anything that you like. Unlike board games and video games, that in board games, the use of different features of the playing piece that you are playing, in that case, they have to be within the rules or house ruled. If you decided to come up with your own rules for the game, you set those rules before you start to play so that you do not feel like you are cheating halfway through the game. And in the case of video games, yes, there is only so much that you can program into a single game without spending like a lifetime. There are some video games that come pretty close but not close enough to a role-playing game experience, to a tabletop role-playing game experience, and they take so many years. You know, the typical case of there is this really good first-person RPG. What was the name? I think it was Grimoire Wings of the Exalted, Heralds of the Exalted. I always forget the name, but I have played that. It's a very difficult old school RPG, and there are so many things that I think the designer got right. I think it was the work of a single man with some assets, of course, but it's still quite impressive. But it's still quite limited when compared to a tabletop role-playing game because of all of the things that you can carry out, that you can attempt in a tabletop role-playing game. There are no limits. That is, it doesn't mean that your character can do anything, but you can attempt almost everything using your resources, your weapons, your spells, your abilities, etc. So once I started to play tabletop role-playing games at a certain level, I started to understand this, and I became addicted to this simulation aspect. Addicted in a good way. Maybe addicted is not a good way to say it, more like it became a part of my thought processes. So from then on, ever since I started playing role-playing games, with my first experience being in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons many years back, every situation that I encountered in my life, my mind always tried to create these scenarios on how things could proceed if I attempted this or that. I think that a lot of people that made terrible mistakes in their lives, I mean, nobody is perfect, of course, but I think they would have benefited, they would have obtained just like some way to, if not lessen the impact of those mistakes, maybe they would have avoided those mistakes entirely if they had carried out those simulations in their mind. So any sort of problem, which is related to what Chris answered about problem solving, you carry out those simulations like a mini role-playing game in your head, and you start to think, oh, should I do this? And you start to imagine, you're playing yourself as a player character in your mind, and you start to visualize what happens if you attempt this or that. It's almost like a certain aspect or level of those divination systems, you know, the tarot and the runes. For those of you that don't think there is anything spiritual to them, they could still serve as a tool to create those simulations, to create those predictive models. So that's the thing with role-playing games. They allow you to create those predictive models. You start to play that game, and before you take a decision, before you take action, this is not always possible, but there are many situations in life, in my opinion, where you can plan ahead. So you plan ahead, you're thinking in your mind, you're playing this mini role-playing game in your mind, and you come up with a plausible or potentially correct solution. Now, when it comes to learning, role-playing games, in my opinion, encourage you to inform yourself about many things that you ignore, or that you are not, yes, really capable in terms of knowledge or your mental resources to handle in a role playing game. Sometimes you're making your checks, you're trying to play as a character with a very different profession from your own, perhaps in a completely alien setting, a science fantasy setting, or anything. So you start to learn about those things in which you are lacking. Maybe your character is an artist and you think, oh, I know almost nothing about poetry or painting or whatever or music, and you get quite curious and you start to inform yourself about that, especially if your group is somewhat serious about just getting things right when representing a character. Like I said in another video, maybe you have that session 0 and you decide to play as this musician, or maybe you decide to play as this engineer, or maybe as a lawyer. And in order for you to represent that character adequately enough in the next session, you start to read, to watch videos, to talk to people that are actually within those fields. Or if it's a fantasy setting, you start to obtain knowledge from the closest thing possible. Maybe there aren't wizards like in Dungeons and Dragons, but maybe you want to read about the occult, or maybe about science, because magic in Dungeons and Dragons sometimes borrows things from the occult and sometimes from science at the same time. So that way you can come up with some creative ways to roleplay as your character, and you learn some things along the way. Your culture level rises in real life, so to speak. There is also a very interesting, I don't know how I would call it, but it's a product of this simulation and learning process. You start to unravel mysteries, questions, things that are not very clear in real life when you think about the settings in role-playing games. In my opinion, I think that a lot of fiction writers are true seers sometimes. They come up with these stories, all of those scenarios, of those pulp stories. Sometimes in literature, they predict these outcomes in the future, and suddenly it happens in real life. Some could say, well, it has to do with some sort of predictive programming, perhaps. Or maybe the individuals are just so smart, the writers of different novels and books, etc., that they manage to foresee the future. They come up with what I told you, these predictive models. They carry out these simulations and they come up with these predictions of what could happen in the future. I think this also happens in role-playing games, and sometimes, just like in other media or other fictional forms of entertainment that have to do with fiction, sometimes they don't get it quite right, but at the same time you obtain those insights. For example, and this is not to point out to a particular game designer, but there was this game designer. I actually talked to him a few times in forums many years back, and he came up with this setting in the future where this, let's call it country A. Country A had many problems in his setting, so the people from country A had to flee or escape to country B. And I thought that's actually not plausible because of the situation of the world. And later on, now we find ourselves in present times, and I'm not going to refer to which specific countries have to do with his prediction, so to speak, but it happened the other way around. It was actually country B that had this problem, and the citizens of country B started to escape towards country A. So yes, I think he got it almost quite right, but I consider it that he was somewhat biased because he lived in country A. He was kind of steering things towards country B, like country B is in trouble, country B has these problems because he lived in country A. Surely there weren't any problems in country A. Country A was pretty safe, but it was the other way around. I wonder if he noticed that when that event in real life happened. Who knows? I also find it disappointing that sometimes people do not realize this. And like I said, this also happens in video games, in board games, in many other things, in anime, manga, movies, comic books. You see these people enjoying those forms of entertainment. Let's stick to role playing games. You see someone, the players and the game master, enjoying different role playing games that have very complicated, sorry, very complicated storylines or plot lines. And you think they are going to think about, they are going to consider those political and social complexities in real life. But no, they are completely oblivious. So yes, that's really disappointing, and I think maybe it's some sort of denial or mental blockage when they see these villains, these yes, nefarious plans happening in the setting of a role-playing game, and the same thing is happening in real life, and they do not make the connection. So yes, for example, this is much, more than anything related to video games. There is a guy, I don't know how, if he's still going to continue with his channel, but he had pretty decent content when it comes to video games. And he was constantly talking about these video games with all sorts of plans to eliminate humanity and cause wars, conflicts between nations. And he couldn't accept that was actually happening in real life. So very disappointing. He also think that this was going to heal you, this thing right here that I cannot mention because YouTube would take down the video. And now he is really sick, and his son as well, after he took that. So yes, extremely disappointing overall. But on the positive side, like I said, there are always going to be intelligent, creative, imaginative people that use role-playing games as some sort of tool to improve themselves, even if you are playing role-playing games just to entertain yourself, just to relax, have some fun, have a good time with friends, or if you are playing a solo role-playing game, just have that private time of entertainment and like a creative exercise. Even that can be a sort of relaxation when compared to some other situations in real life. Yes, I think those people are going to benefit greatly from role-playing games, coming up with those simulations, learning things. Sometimes role-playing games, they include real scientific facts, not the dogma and doctrine that they want to sell to you as science in current times, but rather logic, reasoning, encouraging you to examine things, to come up with your own conclusions. Those role-playing games are amazing, and even if they are completely disconnected from real life, they have those exaggerations, those fictional elements. They could serve as some sort of, if not inspiration, as a fictional model to you, for you to compare with real things related to science, technology, philosophy in real life. So yes, a very interesting question. Thank you, Chris, for asking this question. And I really want to know your opinion, that is the opinion of everyone watching this video. What did you obtain from role-playing games that helped you in some way to improve yourself? Chris already gave me his answer about obtaining benefits in terms of understanding, probabilities, problem solving, etc. But I want to know about everyone else that watches this video. What did you obtain from role-playing games that helped you along the way to become a better person? Or do you think that there is something bad about role-playing games that actually presented an obstacle when it comes to improving yourself? Please let me know in the comments section, or make a video response, anything that you like. So once again, thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your question, Chris. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.